There's a kind of silence that isn't peaceful. It's the silence that comes after you've said too much and no one really listened. The silence that wraps itself around your chest when your voice has been misunderstood, mocked, or worse, ignored. And maybe that's where you are right now. Not because you don't care, but because you cared too deeply for too long. And it felt like shouting into an empty canyon, only to hear your own pain echo back. Have you ever stopped mid-sentence because you realized the person in front of you wasn't really there? Not fully. Their eyes were on you, but their heart was elsewhere. So you swallowed the rest of your sentence, and with it, a piece of yourself. This isn't about being introverted or shy. This is about the kind of silence that grows slowly, like moss, over words you once tried to say. And here's the truth. Your silence doesn't mean you have nothing to say. It just means you've said so much that was never truly heard. And now your voice lives more comfortably in your chest than out in the world. But what if your silence is actually saying more than your words ever could? People don't often notice when you go quiet. They notice when you explode, when you break. But the stillness before that, the withdrawal, they brush it off as you being distant, or moody, or too sensitive. No one seems to realize that silence is often a survival tactic, a quiet way of protecting what's left of your energy. Because how many times can someone explain their heart and have it stepped over before they just stop talking? You see, some people don't stop speaking because they've run out of things to say. They stop because they're exhausted from translating themselves to people who don't really want to understand. So they learn to speak in other ways. Through their eyes, through their art, through what they don't say. But deep down, there's still a longing. To be seen, to be heard, not loudly, but fully. Maybe you've noticed it in yourself. The way you rehearse conversations in your head, knowing you won't say them out loud. The way you want to respond to someone's careless comment, but you just nod instead. The way your throat tightens not from anger, but from restraint. This silence, it becomes a home. Not because it's comfortable, but because it's safer. But here's something you need to know. Silence isn't strength if it's rooted in fear. And silence isn't peace if it's built on pain. Sometimes we confuse stillness with healing, when in truth, it's just suppressed grief wearing a quiet mask. You weren't meant to stay quiet forever. You were meant to pause, to gather strength, and to return. The world may have taught you that your voice is too much, too soft, too inconvenient. But the truth? Your voice is necessary, not just for others, for you. Because when we silence ourselves too long, we start to disappear from our own lives. We begin to watch instead of participate, observe instead of act. And eventually, we forget what it even felt like to express anything at all. But here's the thing. Even if you haven't spoken your truth in months, years, decades, it's still inside you. It didn't die. It's just waiting. Waiting for a space safe enough. A moment strong enough. A version of you brave enough. And maybe that moment is now. There's a strange guilt that comes with silence, isn't there? As if by not speaking, you're failing some unspoken rule. As if choosing quiet means you're broken. But silence is not the enemy. It's what lives inside the silence that matters. See, silence can be sacred. It can be the place where healing begins. Not in the noise of advice or the pressure to explain, but in the gentle stillness where your soul can finally breathe. But too often, your silence gets misread. People think you're okay because you're not complaining. They assume your quiet is peace when it's actually pressure, stacked up like unread messages in your mind. And here's the truth no one really talks about. You've probably learned to protect others from your pain. You shrink it, compress it, turn it into a smile, a joke, I'm just tired. But you're not just tired. You're carrying emotional weight no one sees. Because you stopped trying to explain it a long time ago. You didn't want to sound dramatic. You didn't want to seem needy. You didn't want to be a burden. So instead, you swallowed it. You became your own listener, your own comfort. And while that kind of self-reliance can be powerful, it can also be lonely. You don't need to turn every silence into a speech. You don't owe your story to everyone. But you do owe something to yourself. Honesty, not with the world. With you. Ask yourself, what am I not saying that I wish someone would ask me about? What part of me is screaming behind this silence? Because the longer we ignore that voice, the more it finds other ways to come out. In anxiety, tension, burnout, emotional distance. Our unspoken truths always find an exit. And here's where the shift begins. Silence can become power, but only when it's chosen, not forced. Silence can be strength, but only when it's healing, not hiding. There is a kind of silence that comes from wisdom, from understanding that not everything deserves a response, that not every wound needs an audience, that peace sometimes means walking away instead of arguing. That kind of silence, that's maturity, that's inner grounding. That's the silence of someone who knows themselves deeply. But most of us don't start there. We start with the silence of exhaustion, of self-protection, of feeling like if we speak again, we might fall apart. So what do? We begin by listening, not to others, not to the noise of expectations, but to the part of us that we've silenced. You can't heal what you pretend isn't hurting. You can't grow if you keep shrinking every emotion into a quiet nod. And you definitely can't love yourself fully if you're only allowing parts of yourself to speak. There's a quiet voice in you, maybe long buried, that still wants to write, or cry, or pray, or shout, or create something real again. That voice doesn't need an audience. It just needs permission. You don't have to tell the whole world your truth. But maybe you need to start telling yourself. Write it down. Speak it out loud, even if no one's in the room. Look in the mirror and finally say what you've been avoiding. I'm not fine. I'm tired. I need help. I want more than this. These are not weak confessions. They're human. They're sacred. And they're the beginning of finding your voice again. Not for performance, but for presence. There is nothing wrong with being quiet. There is nothing wrong with not always knowing what to say. But when your silence becomes a cage, it's time to unlock it. And no one can do that for you but you. Maybe you were taught to make yourself small, to be agreeable, to only speak when spoken to. But you're not a background character in your own life. You're not here to nod through every conversation, to agree just to avoid conflict, to pretend just to be accepted. You're allowed to take up space, even with silence, even with awkward words, even when your voice shakes. You're allowed to speak, not when it's perfect, but when it's real. Your silence has served a purpose. It kept you safe. It helped you survive moments when speaking would have only made things worse. And for that, you should be grateful to it. But survival is not the same as living. And maybe now, just maybe, it's time to shift. You don't have to become loud. You don't have to broadcast your soul to the world. But you do have to invite your voice back in. Not to perform, not to impress, but to reclaim the parts of you that went silent not because they were wrong, but because they were ignored. So how do you begin? Start small. Start soft. Write one truth in a notebook that no one else will read. Say one sentence out loud to yourself in the mirror. Have one honest conversation with someone who's earned the right to hear it. This is not about making noise. It's about making meaning. If your silence has been your shield, let your truth be your sword. Not to fight others, but to cut through the fog inside you. Because here's what happens when you start expressing again. You stop living only in your head. You stop replaying the same loops of doubt, regret, and what if. And you begin to take shape again, to be seen, even by yourself. Your thoughts become clearer when you give them a voice. Even if that voice is trembling, even if that voice is just a whisper at first, there is someone in the world who needs to hear what you've locked inside. But more than that, you need to hear it. Because silence doesn't always mean strength. Sometimes it just means you've been carrying too much for too long, and no one noticed. But now you've noticed, and that changes everything. Because once you become aware of what's happening beneath your silence, you start to make conscious choices instead of unconscious withdrawals. You don't ghost people anymore. You protect your peace with clarity. You don't bottle emotions. You learn how to hold them with compassion. You don't pretend to be okay. You learn to say, I'm struggling today, without guilt. This is growth, and it's quiet at first, but it's also steady, and beautiful, and real. Maybe your healing isn't loud. Maybe your transformation doesn't look like a grand speech or a public breakthrough. Maybe it looks like closing the door, sitting with your feelings, and finally writing the letter you never had the courage to send. Maybe it looks like turning your pain into a poem, or your numbness into a melody, or your silence into stillness, not empty, but full of listening. And eventually, your voice returns. Not the old version, but the one that's been reshaped by fire, by resilience, by quiet nights of reflection no one else witnessed. That voice, it doesn't shout. It doesn't beg. It speaks with quiet conviction, with authority born from authenticity. It doesn't need to be approved, because it already knows it belongs. And when you speak from that place, even your softest words have the power to shift someone's entire world. So, no, your silence doesn't mean you have nothing to say. It means you've been waiting for the right moment, the right safety, The right version of yourself to rise and speak again. Maybe this is that moment. Maybe now is when you stop hiding behind the idea that no one will understand and start realizing that your story, your truth, your quiet strength was never meant to stay buried. You're not invisible. You're not broken. You're not voiceless. You're just becoming. And sometimes, becoming starts in silence.